Yo, how's it going? Today I'm gonna bring you a bit more competitive content. We'll be looking at tier 1 decks. Specifically, I'm gonna showcase the Siphon Wizard versus Moon ETF matchup. Even though these are tier 1 decks, you won't see tier 1 play. Myself and my opponent, who is Tagore, are actually piloting these decks for the first time. So yeah, it's going to be a lot of stumbling, a lot of misplays. But the whole point of this is for me to explain from the perspective of Siphon Wizard what seems good, what cards seem good, what cards don't seem good, and or other plays that make sense and don't make sense, and everything else and so forth. Unlike most of my typical videos, this will not be a play-by-play commentary of the game that's going on in the background. I'll be focusing more on the decks themselves and the strategies behind them. It's going to be a mumbo-jumbo of stuff. It might be a bit disorganized, but hopefully this video will allow those of you who haven't had much practice with these tier 1 decks a little insight as to why they're strong and how you can possibly counter them. Ready or not? Let's go! Game number 1, we have myself playing Siphon Whiz against Tagore playing Moon Spam. Now let's talk cards. We have my console in my hand, Vigil. Now Vigil used to be a staple in Siphon Spam Anarch decks. They used to be very powerful because if you are able to lock the co-op and keep them poor, they can't really play their cards from hand. They can't install more ice because they don't have money to rest them, and asset spam wasn't really a thing in the past. So Vigil was very effective at drawing you cards every turn. Now, a lot less so. Against asset spam, it's typical that the co-op will still spam out assets whether they are rich or poor, because the assets are what makes them rich. Therefore, they are very rarely in a situation where they are over max hand size or at max hand size, meaning Vigil is a lot less good. So yes, I would definitely take out Vigil from this iteration of Siphon Wizard. There are better consoles out there. Turntable allows you to pull a fast one over anyone relying on efficiency committee. And yeah, otherwise there's always Obelisk is not that good because you're not multi-accessing. This Siphon deck, by the way, runs on Keyhole and Mad Dash. Keyhole is pretty good right now because you are not really using that memory since most of your breakers are AI. I mean, you're usually using Ether, and Keyhole is a very strong threat. Right, so my opponent does what most HB spam decks do. They get the Estelle Moon, they protect it with a piece of ice, and now they have money and cards on tap. And my opponent is getting really far away with it. 5 Estelle Moon counters. I can't really contest it without worrying about bumping into an Architect or similar. So what I'm going to do here is to just keep down the rest of the assets for now and take a bit of money, prepare myself for the Siphon. Now, I'm sorry, but I'm going to spoil the outcome of this game. I do end up losing this game to Tagore off the back of not seeing my Siphon at all. This deck runs 3 copies of Siphon. Well, 2 copies, but 1 Planned Assault. So that's essentially 3 copies of blue cards in my deck in 45 cards. All of them were stuck in the bottom 10. So as you see here, I keep drawing, but I just can't find the Siphon. You bet if I find a Siphon here, it's going to be Slap Eater and go ham. But that's not the case here. So I need to come up with a secondary plan. Now my opponent was forced to pop Estelle Moon because I showed the rumor mill of the inject. We'll talk about currents a bit later. But yeah, for now let's talk about breakers of choice. Breakers are a big problem against Moon Spam decks, and is one reason why Moon Spam is so strong right now. Even though HB ETF is not a asset defensive ID, like the likes of Industrial Genomics or Gagarin. Yeah, basically all the other factions have, CTM is one of them. So all the other factions have asset defensive identity. HB does not. But the reason why Moon Spam is now the strongest asset spam archetype is not because of the defense, that the assets are well defended, but more because of their ice. Their ice is nasty. Their ice is really, really good. Eli just came off the most wanted list. Who even thought of that? As a result, you cannot contest these ice early. That is why this moon is living. Normally, most runners would just trash it whether you're wizard or not, but I can't afford to. See? Architect just gets the fire. Or, well, it doesn't. I break it with Ether, but I can't access the moon after that. What a pity. So it's really the ice that causes a lot of problems because they're both hugely taxing and both have a very punishing face check. Architect is a huge tempo swing for the corp, and Fairchild saps your entire turn away. And it's doubly worse if there's an ELP on the board, because that means you can't click through the Fairchild at all. It is the ice that makes this asset spam deck so nasty. So a lot of runner decks simply cannot keep up. If you're not running SMC, if you're not running an AI breaker, you can't really run until you have your decoder and sentry breaker up, and that's a lot of money investment for against a deck that you need to contest assets against. This is the secret ingredient to Moon Spam success. Not the spam. Most people can cope with the spam nowadays with Temujin money. It's the ice. Once they start placing remote ice and jamming assets behind ice, that's when the game starts tearing away in the corp's favor. This is why I cannot control my opponent. They are drawing more cards and more money than I can ever imagine. And I'm supposed to be able to stop it as Wizard, but I can't in my situation. I would like a Siphon here. Now, Siphon is very powerful. Well, it's not game win. It's not like the one hard counter to Moon Spam. Look at my opponent. They're on 24 credits. They can definitely outmoney me even if I'm Siphon spamming them. Why is Siphon powerful? Because against this particular Moon variant, it relies on biotic labels to fast advance agendas, which my opponent should be doing. They realize this a bit later, as you will see. But their main win condition is to fast advance agendas. The other reason why HP Moon Spam is so powerful is because its win condition in agenda points is actually feasible. The other three factions have no feasible way to score global food. This is one of the biggest problems with Netrunner right now. Glacier decks are just not that good. And outside of Glacier decks, there's very few ways to score 5-3 global foods. But this HP deck can do that quite easily with a combination of Jeeves and a couple of biotics. But this requires money, and Siphon Spam denies that money. It also helps that this particular variant of Moon Spam does not pack Crucium Grid nor Caprice Nisei, which would probably be very good tech in a Siphon infested meta. Without these upgrades, it's quite easy to get Siphons off. Not to mention that you're a Wizard, so Siphon Spam works best in Wizard for a very important reason. In a spam infested meta, Wizard keeps their assets and hence the economy down, and Siphon further debilitates them. So this double whammy combination really suppresses Moon Spam, and is for that reason a very good matchup for Siphon Whiz. As if that's not enough, we have the nail in the coffin. The variety of strong currents in Anarch that completely suppress ELP and the corpse strategy. So yeah, you can see that now I have Hacktivist Meeting up. Now, Hacktivist Meeting is often touted as one of the big counter cards against asset spam in general. Certainly for Moon ETF as well, that applies, and this is actually true to some extent. Now, each of the main factions, Anarch, Shaper, Criminal, actually have their own unique answers to spam. Anarchs have Hacktivist, green, Shapers have Astrolabe, and blue, Criminals have Desperado. So all of these are really good answers to asset spam, because Desperado allows you to check all the face down remotes, which means that they cannot sneak agendas past you. One of the most common tactics for spam decks is to just lay down naked 3-2 agendas and then score them off the table. You don't want them to do that. Desperado changes the success rate of that, because it's more likely that the runner will be running a remotes because they are gaining credits for doing so. What about Astrolabe? Astrolabe's amazing. Instead of giving you a credit per remote, it gives you a card per remote, and yeah, that basically means against a deck like ETF Moon Spam, you basically draw your entire deck if you find Astrolabe turn 1. For this reason, I think a lot of Shaper decks nowadays are leaning towards 3 Astrolabe, which is actually quite important. I mean, sadly, it does quash the diversity of Shaper consoles, but I think most Shaper consoles have been rather underpowered even without the presence of spam, so that isn't really a factor. Finally, we have Hacktivist Meeting, which, oh wait, no, Hacktivist is gone. Now I'm playing Rumor Mill instead. So you see, a little problem here is that you notice my opponent scored a Vitruvius. After they scored the Vitruvius, they were able to res everything on the board. This is why you see that earlier on when I played the Hacktivist, I think if you remember, there was only a res Turtlebags, I think, but now there's a res Jeeves, a res Jackson, a res DBS. All these are terrible cards for me as the runner. Them being active for the corp is really bad for me. But yeah, so when a lot of cards are rares, activist becomes a lot less good. You can try to contest each of the remotes, and I really should be doing that, but instead I'm going for the Siphon here because I finally found my Siphon. I finally have money to do stuff. It might be a bit little too late. So yeah, you don't really want to be controlling the core business at this point. They really should have a lot fewer assets than my opponent has at this point. And if your opponent gets a board sprawled out like this is not a very good sign for you unless your deck is designed to not contest assets. So Shaper is a very good example of that. Most Shapers cannot keep up with assets, and that's fine. The thing about nowadays, even though a lot of people hate spam, I am one of them. But the thing about nowadays is that the assets are not that powerful. They are not game locking, game ending like bioethics lock was, and they are not unreasonable like Sensi Actors Union was. While they are still pretty nasty, don't get me wrong, you can still viably win off R&D, and this is something a lot of people are ignoring. If you're building a Shaper deck nowadays, I would just spam a lot of R&D interfaces and lock R&D to oblivion. You can't lose that way. But as Shaper, as Anarch, I really should be contesting my opponent's board. I have 3 recurring credits every turn to do so, and I really should be doing that. Speaking of which, Rumor Mill, the current that replaced Hacktivist, I'm jumping all over the place here. It's gone now, and this is a huge advantage for my opponent. The moment they scored the second Vitruvius that cleared my Rumor Mill, they were able to pop the Estelle Moon that was initially behind the Architect. So now my opponent has lots of cards and credits. That's not good for me. But otherwise, Rumor Mill is a very powerful counter against most Moon spam decks because it shuts down Moon. In fact, it is the only card in the game that can shut down Moon's trash ability. It's very powerful to have a trash ability on an economy card, let alone an economy plus draw card. This is why Advanced Assembly Lines is so powerful. Even though it's a small economy card, the fact that you can liberate it at paid speed means that you're forcing your opponent to run it and they're not getting much in return, and you're still coming out ahead. Whereas with most other economy assets like your like Adonis Campaign, for example, if you res it and your opponent trashes it, you're coming out behind. If your opponent trashes the Adonis and you don't get a tick off of it, you're not gaining, you're not going ahead. So this is what differentiates these more passive assets from the more active assets that allow you to gain resources even though the runner attempts to trash them. So Advanced Assembly Lines is one example, Moon is another example. Very powerful to have a paid ability on an econ / draw card. And as you see here, my opponent wins with double Biotic. So that's very unfortunate for me, but that's mostly because I couldn't find Siphon early, therefore I didn't have the money to keep my opponent's board state down. We'll move on to the next game, game number 2, where we reset the matchup and go for it again. This time I begin with a much better opening hand. There's actually a Count Siphon in it, and if my opponent doesn't find any HQ Ice right now, they're gonna get Siphon locked with the 2 Deja Vus and the same old thing in my hand. This is pretty beautiful. Another important, very important thing is that I actually have MK Ultra in my opening hand. Now, if you study the ice composition of typical Moon spam decks, you will find something that you can actually abuse as Siphon Spam Whiz. So this is where knowledge really is power. The 3 ice that they usually run are Eli, Architect, Fetch Out 3. Good coverage against barrier sentry code gates, across the board, but being lacking in diversity because it's 3 off of 3 different ice, you can actually exploit that very well. Now, which ones have the painful fate? Now, which ones can you actually run through? All of them. Eli's a Bioroid, Fairchild is a Bioroid, so you can click through both of them. Architect's the only one you cannot click through. Architect's the most dangerous. Even though you will still land a successful Siphon through an Architect, you will let them fire Architect, which is usually not in your favor. So what do you want to do? You want your Sentry Breaker up, and then you can safely account Siphon first click, and that's exactly what I do here. With MK Ultra in the bin, I know I can break Architect. Fairchild 3 and Eli are trivial, I'll click through them. The only thing that can stop me are surprise enderruns like Quandaries and Wraparounds, which this deck could run, but you hedge your bets against that. They haven't drawn much of the deck anyway, and sure enough, it's the least worst. It's actually the best ice that I wanted to see. The Eli. So double click, Siphon. My opponent's down to 7 credits. That's fine because I just played Deja Vu to get my Siphon back. Telegraphing to my opponent, I'm gonna do this again, you better place a second piece of ice on HQ. So they might be regretting placing that remote ice there right now. As moon spam against Siphon Wizard, you might want to save your ice for HQ. Defending your remotes might not be that important if you end up getting Siphon spammed anyway. My opponent plays Friends here for Estelle Moon and probably Advanced Assembly Lines. And I prepare myself to siphon through the Eli again. So that's the nice thing about Bioroid Ice, is that until your opponent finds the time to double stack ice on centrals, you can abuse them with powerful run events like Account Siphon. Unfortunately, my opponent actually does have a third piece of ice. They drew fairly decently, so I can't really siphon here. Instead, I go for finding more cards that help me win. Making an entrance here, I see 2 keyholes, milling one of them. So from the corp side, that is a very sure sign that I actually have a keyhole in hand, or one that I found on making an entrance, as is the case here. If the runner is milling keyhole into their bin, it means they already have another copy. You need to start defending R&D. And here's the second part of what makes Siphon Wizard so strong. You need ice against Siphon Wizard for both HQ and R&D, because if you over ice your HQ, sure, you're not getting Siphon, but you're getting keyhole locked, and that is really bad. Furthermore, I play Hacktivist Meeting here to really put the hurt in my opponent, to really deter them from rezzing the assets. They still grit Death Heath and res the DBS here. This is their loss. But anyway, going back to what I was saying, my opponent should be very wary of the R&D attack vector here. Unless they have something that can save them, like a bunch of Jackson Howards on the table, they should seriously consider icing up R&D. If they found any ice, that is. So the early assault is what makes this deck so strong, and coupled with Mad Dash, which Siphon Wizard also runs. Mad Dash is a very good counter against HB decks in general. This one's no exception, because they're all 2-pointer agendas in the deck, including Global Food for the runner. So Mad Dash allows you to get that magic 7th point, so that you win on 3 agendas rather than 4. Again, you see how this entire deck just synergizes with itself so well, and every single card in it deals with moon spam so very well. It's a pretty favorable matchup. Now, I'm going to check remotes here because this was very suspicious, and yeah, my opponent was trying to sneak out a Vitruvius here. This is a mind game that you can take advantage of against your opponent. If your opponent is like, oh man, I'm stuck with Hacktivist running, I can't get my board state going, all my assets are unres, this Hacktivist is really causing trouble because I have very few cards in my hand. What do? I'm going to try to jam agendas in the remote to try to score them. And that's where you can take advantage of that psychology to run their remote and call their bluff. So that's how I managed to steal the Vitruvius. Otherwise, why would I run into ice without a good suite of breakers up? I kind of knew that my opponent would jam agendas there. And here I just close out the game because Keyhole netted me 1 agenda. My opponent pitched 1 agenda to the Hacktivist, and Mad Dash gets me to 7 points for a convincing victory. So there you have it. Even though we have 2 games with the same matchup but wildly different outcomes, well, that's just the nature of card games. It happens, and it's not just to this matchup. A lot of other matchups also come down to draw. I had a horrible, uncharacteristic first game, draw in the first game, and my second game went a lot better. My opponent had okay draw, but I just had a pretty nut draw with Siphon and Kyo early. That's what you always want to see as Siphon Wizard. That being said, I would still say Siphon Wizard is rather favored in this matchup, for the simple reason that Siphon Wizard is packed with cards that, as I said, not only synergize with each other, but also are super effective against Moon ETF. Now, caveat time. Everything that I've said so far is based on the assumption that your opponent is playing the Chris Dyer version of Moon ETF, the one that won our BABW finals. The deck list for that, as well as a couple of Siphon Wizard deck lists, will go into the video description. Just this once, because I use the Patreon page mostly only for my own deck list. So go to the video description if you want to see sample deck lists for both sides, but in general, playstyles will differ if the Moon ETF deck is tagged differently, and you should be aware of that as the Siphon Whiz player. Otherwise, that's all I have. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found this informative. See you next time. Goodbye.